everybody. Welcome back to my channel, and thank you for joining me for another true crime deep dive. Now, this deep dive is only going to be in one part. It'll just be a longer sort of video, but it's a past case that has now become relevant again. And this happened on the morning of May 25th, 1979, when 6-year-old Etan Patz left his family's third-floor apartment in Soho and set off on a short walk to catch the school bus, a route that spanned just 2 city blocks. He never made it to the bus. In an instant, a family was shattered, a city was shaken, and the country found itself facing a terrifying new reality that a child could vanish without a trace in the middle of New York City in broad daylight. Etan Patz would become the first missing child to appear on a milk carton. His father's photographs, once used to document his son's childhood, were suddenly transformed into a nationwide alert. And May 25, the day Etan disappeared, is now recognized as National Missing Children's Day, a somber legacy born from unimaginable loss. For over 3 decades, Etan's case went unsolved. Then, in 2012, police announced they had a suspect, Pedro Hernandez, a former bodega clerk who confessed to luring Etan into a basement and killing him. He was arrested, charged, and ultimately convicted in 2017. But now, nearly 50 years after Etan vanished, the case is no longer closed. Pedro Hernandez's conviction has been overturned. His lawyer argued that his confession was unreliable. It was the product of a low IQ, severe mental illness, and hours of intense police questioning. There was no physical evidence tying him to Etan, and now a judge has agreed. His conviction has been thrown out. So the question hangs in the air once again. Did Pedro Hernandez really kill Etan Patz? Or was this yet another dead end in a case that has been haunted by false leads, media frenzies, and overlooked suspects? Because here's the thing. There was another man, a man who had a documented history of luring and assaulting young boys, a man who had ties to Etan's babysitter, a man who kept photos of blonde-haired, blue-eyed children in his secret hideout, and who once admitted to being 90% sure that Etan had been in his apartment the day he disappeared. His name is Jose Ramos, and many still believe he was the one responsible for what happened to Etan Patz. In today's episode, we're going to unravel this decades-long investigation, from the hopeful early days of community-wide searches and psychic tips to a confession that may not have been real, and a suspect who may have always been hiding in plain sight. Because the truth is, they may have put the wrong man behind bars, and the boy whose face is now a symbol of a nation's fear may still be waiting for justice. We have a lot to talk about today, a lot. This is a very important case to talk about right now, but before we dive in, let's have a word from the sponsor of today's video, Helix Sleep. Today's video is sponsored by Helix, and before we dive into today's story, let me just say this. If I'm going to lie awake at night thinking about true crime, I want to at least be comfortable doing it. You spend a third of your life in bed, so why settle for a mattress that doesn't fit your body, your sleep style, or your borderline addiction to watching documentaries until 2 a.m.? That's why I switched to Helix Sleep. Helix makes premium mattresses that are customized to you, your body, your sleep habits, and your comfort level. And you're going to get started the same way that I did, which is by taking their sleep quiz, which asks questions like how you sleep, what kind of firmness you like, and even whether you sleep alone or with someone else. No comment. And I got matched with a mattress that was basically made for me. I've had my Helix Midnight Luxe mattress for, I think, over 5 years now, and it's just as comfortable today as it was the day I set it up. I sleep on my side, I like a firmer mattress, and I do tend to sleep hot, especially during these humid New York summers, and Helix delivered to my front door the answers to all my sleep prayers. Since switching to Helix, I'm sleeping deeper, longer, and waking up without those weird neck kinks that made me feel like I'd spent the night in a haunted attic. The neck pain was the worst. And summer nights, no problem. Helix keeps me cool even when the AC is losing its will to live. And when the temperatures are pushing, 98 degrees here, you all know the air conditioner cannot keep up, and Helix delivers for free right to your door. They offer a 100-night sleep trial so you can try your new mattress out risk-free and stress-free. And if it doesn't work for you, no worries, because Helix will take it back. No questions asked. They aren't nosy like that. And get this, 82% of people in their sleep study actually got more deep sleep after switching to Helix. I didn't even know you could measure that, but I love that someone did. And I have convinced basically everyone in my family to switch to a Helix mattress. And a lot of them do wear smart watches or smart rings that monitor their sleep. And they've reported the same: less tossing, less turning, less waking up randomly, more deep sleep. And that's the key, right? That's what we all want. That's what helps us be our best selves day in and day out. And for real, this mattress has changed my sleep. I feel more rested, less cranky, and mildly more emotionally prepared to read through terrifying police transcripts. So if you're ready to sleep like a person who doesn't lie awake, reimagining unsolved mysteries, take advantage of Helix's exclusive 4th of July partner offer. You're going to get 27% off site-wide. All you have to do is go to helixsleep.com/Harlowe or scan the QR code right on screen. Once again, that's helixsleep.com/Harlowe. And you're going to get 27% off site-wide. That means their mattresses. That also means their pillows. And Helix Sleep has some amazing pillows. My favorite, trust me. This is one case where the solution really is a mattress. Thank you so much to Helix for sponsoring today's video, and let's dive in. Etan Patz was born on October 9, 1972, to his parents Stanley and Julie, who were originally from Massachusetts. The couple had relocated to New York City, where Stanley, who worked as a photographer, purchased a loft at 113 Prince Street in the Soho district in 1971 for $7,500. And I guarantee you that loft would go for millions today. Even at the time, though, the loft needed a lot of work. There was no plumbing, there was no electricity. The place was just kind of a mess, but Stanley and his wife Julie saw the potential in this diamond in the rough and believed it was a place they could happily raise their growing family. Now, in 1979, the Soho district of Manhattan was a place caught between two identities: gritty and industrial on one hand, but quietly transforming into a cultural haven on the other. The name Soho itself comes from its location, south of Houston Street, nestled between Canal Street to the south, Houston Street to the north, Lafayette Street to the east, and 6th Avenue to the west. Today, it is one of the trendiest neighborhoods in New York City and one of the most expensive areas to live in New York City. It's home to luxury boutiques, art galleries, and lofts worth millions. But when 6-year-old Etan Patz disappeared from its cobblestone streets in May of 1979, Soho looked and felt very different. Back then, the neighborhood still bore the bones of its past life. It was a maze of abandoned factories, derelict warehouses, and dark, narrow air shafts, some of which hadn't seen proper renovation in decades. The city's manufacturing decline had left Soho a quiet, almost ghostly place, and it was common to find entire buildings repurposed by artists and bohemians who were drawn to the neighborhood's vast loft spaces and cheap rent. Etan's family was one of them. Soho in the late 70s was not yet the residential destination it would become. It was a raw and rugged part of the city, not suburban, not fully urbanized, and not yet gentrified. It had the feel of a village tucked inside a city, with kids playing on the sidewalks, neighbors who knew each other by name, and an arts community that was tightly knit. But there was a flip side to that charm. Soho's labyrinth of back alleys, rooftops, and unregulated spaces also made it a difficult and dangerous place to search when something went wrong. When Etan vanished, the NYPD described the task of canvassing the neighborhood as daunting. There were too many doors, too many air shafts, and too many forgotten corners where a small boy could disappear without a sound, without a trace. Etan Patz was a blonde-haired, blue-eyed first-grade student at the Independence Plaza School on Greenwich Street. He was a typical 6-year-old boy who sat right in the middle of two siblings, his older sister Shira, who was 9, and his younger brother Ari, who was just 2 years old in 1979. On the morning of May 25th, which was a Friday, Etan woke up early and got himself dressed, as the rest of his family woke up also and began to prepare for the day. His mother, Julie, ran a daycare nursery out of the loft, and aside from her 2-year-old son, Ari, she was also in charge of another young child that morning. Etan's sister, Shira, was the one who usually walked him the short 2 blocks from the loft to the bus stop, but that morning she was running behind, and Etan asked his mother if he could walk to the bus stop alone. Julie Patz said that Etan had asked to do this many times before. He was getting a little bit older, he was testing out his independence, but she'd always said no. His parents thought he was too young. However, on this morning, after telling him multiple times that he could not go alone, Julie caved and allowed Etan to head off down the street solo.
It was the last school day before a long Memorial Day weekend.
I think that I was probably in the bathroom shaving when Etan went out the door.
Did your wife take Etan down the elevators?
No, since we're only on the 3rd floor, we use the stairs.
Down the stairs and out onto Prince Street. It was a red-letter day for first grader Etan. For months, he'd been pestering his parents to walk alone to the school bus stop just 2 blocks away. Today, they finally agreed, and away he went.
In the early days, you and your wife took a lot of criticism about letting Etan go by himself that day. That must have been tough.
Well, we did, but at some point in every parent's life, they send their children to school alone.
Yeah.
Did we do it too early? Obviously, we did. It was very familiar territory. This was a very safe neighborhood. When you let them out of your sight, when they're 21?
Back upstairs, Julie could have followed some of Etan's path from their fire escape, but today she got busy with their other children. And Stan, a commercial photographer, went about his day with a photo shoot uptown.
Julie Patz said that after she walked Etan downstairs, she watched him walk west on Prince Street and approach Wooster Street. And this was the first of 2 streets that he would have to cross before reaching West Broadway, where the bus stop was located. This was around 8 a.m., and Etan was dressed in blue pants, a blue jacket, and blue sneakers with bright fluorescent stripes on them. These types of sneakers were very common in the late 70s and even going into the 80s. And on Etan's head sat a black Eastern Airlines pilot's cap, and swinging in his hand was a lunchbox decorated with red and white elephants. Dorsey Whitaker, the neighborhood mailman working his regular route that morning, would later report seeing Etan standing at the intersection of Prince and Wooster. And Whitaker noticed the young boy because he said Etan was standing still, peering down Wooster Street as if he was looking for something or someone. Whitaker would tell investigators, quote, "I saw him standing there, but I had my back to him when I walked away," end quote. And that's an important detail. Whitaker didn't see Etan cross the street. He didn't see anyone approach him. He simply passed by the boy and moved on with his deliveries, assuming nothing was out of the ordinary. And this would be the last independent, verified sighting of Etan, and it placed him about halfway to the bus stop. Now, the bus driver said that Etan had never made it to the bus stop, but there is some really important context to this. In mid-February of 1979, roughly 8,000 school bus drivers represented by a national labor union began a strike in protest of the city's plans under then Mayor Ed Cook. And these plans would allow competitive bidding for school bus contracts. The drivers felt that this would jeopardize their job security, their wages, their seniority guarantees. So they went on strike, and the strike lasted, I believe, around 13 to 14 weeks. And as I'm sure you can guess, this severely disrupted school transportation across the city. The parents were not happy about it. Nobody was happy about it. Now, by May of 1979, when Etan went missing, the strike was winding down. It still hadn't been totally resolved. And the school district was scrambling to maintain service. So, as a result, many regular bus drivers were absent, and replacement drivers, unfamiliar with the routes and the schedules, were put in their place. So, on May 25th, 1979, the bus driver assigned to Etan's route was new and inexperienced with the students, and this led to significant confusion. The driver left the bus stop early with only 6 students on board, not knowing that he should have had 24. Unfortunately, in 1979, there were no standardized systems or requirements in New York City, or honestly, in most of the United States, for schools to notify parents when a child didn't show up for class. So, you know how if your kid's sick home from school, the school will call you and be like, hey, little Johnny's not here. And then you're like, yeah, he's got a runny nose and a fever, so I kept him home. This was not happening then. Kids just didn't show up, and the school was like, okay, I'm sure they're sick or playing hooky or whatever. And nobody was ever called. So when Etan Patz did not arrive at school on May 25th, no one from the school called his parents, and his absence wasn't flagged as unusual because absentee tracking was not automated or strictly monitored, especially in the early elementary grades. Teachers often took attendance manually, and unless parents themselves had reported an absence, there was no system in place to verify if the child was simply staying home sick or playing hooky or in trouble, missing, etc. When Etan didn't get off the bus that afternoon, his parents called the school and they were informed that he had been absent that day. And this is when Stanley and Julie Patz called the police. Police used the information of mailman Dorsey Whitaker to establish their initial search perimeter, focusing on the stretch of Prince Street between Etan's apartment and West Broadway. And of course, as time went on, they would expand that search out several city blocks. And what's always made this case especially chilling is that the abduction seems to have occurred within a block, in broad daylight, in a place where Etan was known and recognized. It seemed that outside of Dorsey Whitaker, the mailman, no one had seen Etan. Not one person had seen anything out of the ordinary that Friday morning. And the search for Etan Patz has been described as being a small-town style search in the largest city in the United States. In a city of millions where people often pass each other like ships in the night, the disappearance of Etan Patz brought an unexpected sense of closeness, even intimacy. Though it happened in Manhattan's Soho district, an area better known in 1979 for its cast iron factories, aging warehouses, and emerging art scene than for any sense of neighborly warmth, the search for 6-year-old Etan felt more like something out of a quiet rural town than the nation's largest metropolis. As soon as word spread that Etan had never made it to school that morning, New Yorkers sprang into action. Police launched a massive response with hundreds of officers canvassing the area on foot, checking every basement, rooftop, air shaft, and alley in Soho's tangled industrial terrain. They used helicopters and harbor patrols to scour the nearby Hudson River, and sound trucks broadcasting Etan's description as they crawled street by street. And when I read this part, during my research, I was like, it is so weird to think about because now we have cell phones, so you can put out Amber Alerts, and we have social media, and you can see when people go missing and keep up with it. But they didn't really have anything like that then. They had, TV. But if you wanted to get the word out quickly and not wait for the evening news, you would bring in a sound truck, which would be just a police truck with a big, megaphone on the top, and they would drive through the streets announcing that Etan was missing and giving his description and just letting people know relevant information. A green van parked outside the Patz's family building served as a makeshift command post and hotline center, and at first, they were receiving up to 500 calls a day. However, unfortunately, many of these calls were from psychics offering wildly conflicting but always hopeful messages. The community didn't just watch, they mobilized. Within days, local parents formed the Etan Patz Action Committee, which quickly grew from 40 to over 170 volunteers. They blanketed the neighborhood with missing posters in English, Spanish, and Chinese, reflecting the diversity of Soho at the time. Local businesses donated printing services and offered rewards, and neighborhood children helped tape up flyers. Even street sweepers from Times Square in the Garment District volunteered to distribute flyers during their shifts. It was amazing. It was a tidal wave of collective effort, as if everyone in the city suddenly realized this could have been their child. Despite its size and population, New York City felt small during those early days of the search. The Pates' family grief became everyone's grief, and the streets of Soho, usually loud and chaotic, grew quiet with worry. The NYPD posted officers inside the Pates apartment 24 hours a day, and officers on the streets knocked on doors, questioned neighborhood residents, and pulled criminal records of locals who might have had a hand in Etan's disappearance. But time after time, they came up empty. In the words of one officer, quote, "All I've been doing is canvassing and re-canvassing the area, checking air shafts, basements, and rooftops. It's just so frustrating," end quote. Another police officer admitted, quote, "So far, all we've been doing is harassing a lot of people because we've turned up nothing," end quote. The futility only deepened the city's resolve. For several weeks in the late spring of 1979, the biggest city in America shrank down to the size of a neighborhood block, unified by the hope of bringing one little boy home. It was really, really amazing. It was very interesting to see the difference in how people reacted to a missing child then and how they react to a missing child now, because now it's so common. Every time you open up your, internet and you look at the news, there's a child missing or a child's been taken from the world. Every time you open social media, there's a new Amber Alert. So it's almost like people have become desensitized, but back then they really did all that they could. And there were a few reports that came out in the early days of the investigation that did make it to the public, meaning the police must have felt that these tips and sightings were potentially valid enough to share. Howard Belasco, manager of the Gem Lumber Company located at 175 Spring Street, claimed that he had seen Etan and another little boy at his shop between 4:30 and 5 p.m. the evening of May 25th, which is the day that Etan went missing. Belasco said that he had recognized Etan from the missing persons photos that were being circulated by police, and according to him, the two boys entered the rear of his lumber store, took scraps of wood from a bin, and purchased 2 boxes of nails. Julie Pates had provided police with items that belonged to Etan that would have had his scent on them, including his bed sheets, and police dogs reportedly picked up Etan's scent trail at the lumber store, but the scent disappeared once they exited back onto the street. And as it turns out, this sighting probably doesn't have much credibility to it because Etan was reported missing early that afternoon, and by 4:30 p.m., police had already launched an intense search effort. As Howard himself said, he recognized Etan from the flyers that were being handed out. So it's unlikely that Etan would be just casually visiting a store blocks from his home without being noticed or stopped by one of the many searchers. Additionally, no one else confirmed seeing Etan at the lumberyard or in the area at that time. It is interesting that police scent dogs reportedly picked up Etan's scent, but we also do know that it's not a perfect system, and we know that scent trails in urban environments are notoriously unreliable, especially hours after an event and in heavily trafficked areas, which all of New York City is heavily trafficked. Around Memorial Day weekend, within a day or two of Etan's disappearance, a witness came forward claiming to have seen a boy matching Etan's description near Prince Street and West Broadway. This is right near where he would have been waiting for his school bus. Etan was reportedly seen inside an olive green 1974 Ford Galaxy, which had New Jersey license plates featuring the letters IUD. The car was said to be traveling towards the direction of the Holland Tunnel, and this suggested that Etan may have been taken out of New York City and into New Jersey. So in response, the NYPD alerted law enforcement agencies in New Jersey to be on the lookout for that vehicle and for Etan. Now, there was no surveillance cameras in 1979, meaning this claim could never be verified by video footage. No corroborating witnesses came forward to confirm seeing the car, the driver, or a child that looked like Etan Patz inside the vehicle. And despite the specific license plate numbers, no matching vehicle was ever found. The New Jersey DMV and police checked various records, but the lead went cold. At this point, it was very clear that something bad had happened to Etan Patz. He hadn't simply gone in the wrong direction and gotten lost. He had been taken. Julie said that her son was a very friendly and outgoing child, but he was very afraid of being lost. In fact, the thought of being lost to Etan was quite terrifying. Julie told a story once of how they were getting on an elevator, and she got on and the doors closed, and Etan didn't make it on in time, and she had to ride all the way up and then back down to get him. And by the time she got back down to him, he had not moved from that spot. He didn't wander off trying to find her or wander off trying to find the stairs. He was sitting there crying and absolutely terrified. Etan's father, Stanley, also said that Etan was not the type of boy to just wander off, saying, quote, "I tend to doubt he's lost. I tend to doubt he's in the area," end quote. In the early days of the search, both of Etan's parents expressed hope that some nice woman who couldn't have children and who was looking for a child of her own had possibly taken Etan home with her. Julie Patz said, quote, "We know he's alive. Whoever took him might be desperate for a child, but that person can't make Etan happy," end quote.
We have no intention of prosecuting. We just hope that they treat him nicely and get him back to us somehow, anyhow.
In interviews and public appearances, Julie and Stanley Patz were composed and soft-spoken, especially Julie, who often addressed the media and community with a calm resolve. While this was likely her way of staying strong for her children and holding her family together, holding herself together, some members of the public and press misread it as detachment or a lack of emotion. Julie spoke about this later, saying, quote, "It's hard for people to believe that we have any hope left. It's hard for them to look at us and see us outwardly calm, going ahead with life, holding ourselves together as a family. Immediately they suspect us. They doubt the sincerity. We're no good to anybody falling apart, not to our other children and not to Etan," end quote. The decision to allow 6-year-old Etan to walk the 2 blocks to the bus stop alone had become a central point of criticism. Some critics, including other parents, questioned why Stan and Julie had felt this was okay or safe. They both acknowledged this. They were like, yeah, I mean, obviously in hindsight, we wish we hadn't done that, assholes. And Julie said that she and her husband had forced Etan to memorize their home phone number. However, they realized after he went missing that they'd failed to teach him their area code, something that they obviously very much regretted for a long time. Now, for decades, the Patz family refused to move out of their flat. They refused to change their phone number, even though by that time it was publicly available due to the missing child posters, and they were getting horrible prank calls and just fake calls and people like telling them they were bad parents, psychics, just being constantly harassed. But Stan and Julie said they were still waiting for Etan's call. They would always wait for it. And they wanted to be in the home he knew if he ever found his way back. Additionally, one of the main points of suspicion against the parents stemmed from the fact that Stanley at that time was a professional photographer. Stanley Patz had been photographing his children for years. He was a devoted father, and he used his skills to document his family's life. And according to Stan, Etan was his favorite subject. He was a natural in front of the camera, curious and expressive, and Stanley's portraits really captured his son with tenderness and authenticity.
I went into my proof file and I pulled out some pictures that I had taken a few months earlier.
Stan was always snapping pictures of the kids, but these of Etan would enlarge the story, and even today, help define an era.
I had all these pictures of Etan smiling, laughing, playing, fooling around.
Here's his personality
Right.
just beaming out of here.
Right. He was a great kid. And look at his smile.
Oh, man.
But in the emotionally charged environment following Etan's disappearance, some people viewed these images through a lens of suspicion, especially the one in which Etan was shirtless, looking into the camera with an almost haunting vulnerability. Now, this photo became one of the most iconic missing child images of the era. It appeared on posters, milk cartons, news broadcasts, and in the media coverage that spread nationwide. Instead of recognizing the photograph as a father's desperate attempt to help find his child using the best tools he had, some people began to read darker meanings into it. They questioned why a father would take so many pictures of his child. They asked why he had shirtless photos of his son. And in a time when the idea of child sexual abuse was just entering the national conversation, this artistic depiction of Stanley's son became very controversial. Like most parents in missing child cases, Stanley and Julie Patz were thoroughly questioned by police, and Stanley even voluntarily submitted to 3 polygraph tests. One of these tests reportedly indicated a deceptive response when he was asked if he had contact with Etan after the disappearance. That result was never followed up with any concrete evidence. The Patz family fully cooperated with law enforcement at all times, and investigators later stated they had no reason to suspect anyone in the family. Detective Sergeant Robert Tompkins said the investigation had satisfied the police that Etan's parents were innocent. The suspicion, rumors, and allegations did not stop, though. By the end of June 1979, the Patz family was in shambles. Stanley had lost 15 pounds. Neither he nor Julie were sleeping more than 2 hours at a time, and Etan's sister Shira suffered in a tortured withdrawal thinking about the brother she had just started forming a close relationship with. Even 2-year-old Ari, who didn't really know exactly what was going on, he began lashing out. When Ari first realized Etan was missing, he got mad at the police officers and his father because they were unable to find his brother. Julie said, quote, "The police spent some time with him and now he understands that no one knows where Etan is and Etan doesn't know how to get home," end quote. Julie mostly spent her days by the phone and keeping a hawk eye on her other 2 children, not allowing them to go anywhere unsupervised. Shira, who had previously been allowed to walk to school on her own, she was 9 years old, she would now be accompanied by her mother, with Julie stating, quote, "One theory is that this was done as a personal grudge, and although we can't imagine why, we don't want to endanger our other children," end quote. The Patz family was very aware that people were treating them differently, sort of keeping their distance. When Shira's birthday came around, her parents wanted to throw her a party as sort of a bright spot in those dark times, and they invited a dozen of Shira's friends, but no one showed up, prompting Julie to sort of address this, saying, quote, "The community has been very supportive, and people have been wonderful in the search for Etan and distributing more than 300,000 circulars. But I can understand why they personally want to shun us. They're self-conscious, and I suppose parents worry that there's some weirdo out there, and what happened to Etan could happen to their kids," end quote. It breaks my heart thinking about Shira, who was old enough at that point to, know Etan, miss Etan, realize what was going on, and then she has a birthday party and none of her friends show up. And she's just sitting there waiting for people to come to her birthday party and none of her friends show up. So not only has she lost her brother, not only is that going on, but now she can't even distract herself with her friends and to celebrate, her birthday. That really breaks my heart. So at the beginning of June, the NYPD decided to form a special 5-person task force to continue focusing on Etan's case. And this task force was headed by Detective Thomas Finan. In July of 1979, Representative Peter Pizer asked the other 434 congressmen and 100 senators to distribute Etan's picture to newspapers in their home districts, saying he knew it was a long shot, but maybe having Etan's case and his picture more widespread would bring something in. Maybe somebody would see him and say something. And all of these senators and representatives, they did what Pizer asked, impressively. I saw stories about Etan in newspapers all across the United States, in Mississippi, Kentucky, Pennsylvania, Illinois, California, New Jersey, New Mexico, Florida, Montana, even Canada. It was crazy. And those news stories continued, by the way, for years. So all those places that initially put out, his picture and his missing person information continued following his case as it progressed through the years. The NYPD, local law enforcement, was obviously glad for the exposure, with Detective Finan saying it was very possible Etan could be in some other part of the country, in an area where no one was looking for him. The police also continued to insist that they had no evidence that Etan was no longer alive or that he was being harmed. And Detective William Butler said, quote, "Right now we feel that somebody took the boy, but we have no evidence to make us believe anything detrimental has happened to him," end quote. They were still sticking to this in October, with Julie Patz saying that the police had told them they'd found no negative evidence, and in all other cases like Etan's, they would have found evidence suggesting foul play much earlier on. Even so, the NYPD acknowledged that they had nothing, no leads, no theories, no way of knowing where Etan was or what had happened to him. Detective Sergeant Max Sanders with the Missing Persons Bureau told the media, quote, "We get calls every day, but at this point, we have no clue." End quote. And it would be 33 years before an arrest would be made in the disappearance of Etan Patz. But a few things happened between that I want to talk about in order to bring context to what we're going to talk about later. In May of 1985, Assistant U.S. Attorney Stuart Graois was assigned to the case, and Graois was a federal prosecutor who specialized in child exploitation and sexual abuse cases during his career. He was known among colleagues for his tenacity, empathy for victims, and unwillingness to drop a lead, especially when it involved children. And he often worked closely with FBI agents, child welfare officials, and other prosecutors to build long-term cases against child predators who were operating across state lines. In 1985, more than 6 years after Etan's disappearance, Stuart Graois was assigned to re-examine the case under the federal lens, focusing specifically on interstate crimes involving the exploitation of children. The FBI had been monitoring an individual named Jose Antonio Ramos, a known child sex offender with a deeply disturbing history, and Stuart Graois would quickly hone in on Ramos. At the time, Ramos had not been formally charged with anything related to Etan, but he was emerging as the strongest suspect through circumstantial evidence and his own disturbing admissions. Graois personally traveled across the country, tracking Ramos through different states, working with a variety of people who had encountered Ramos, speaking to his former associates, and interviewing children that Ramos had crossed paths with. He also reviewed volumes of psychological reports gathered, items seized in locations where Ramos had lived, and he pursued Ramos in both state and federal court, not just as a prosecutor, but almost as an independent investigator. Stuart Graois was really invested emotionally, mentally in this case, and he was sure he'd found the person who had taken Etan Patz. Graois was also deputized in Pennsylvania in order to prosecute Ramos for child abuse in Erie County. And this was an incredibly rare move. This did not happen often, to have somebody be able to kind of go out of their jurisdiction, and it showed how personally and professionally invested Graois had become in holding Ramos accountable, even outside of Etan's case. We're definitely going to come back to Stuart Graois and Jose Ramos, so put a pin in that. We are going to talk way more about them, and especially about Jose Ramos. On June 19th, 2001, Etan Patz was declared legally dead by a Manhattan judge. 9 years later, in 2010, Manhattan District Attorney Cyrus Vance Jr. officially announced that he would reopen the investigation into Etan Patz's disappearance. Vance had campaigned in part on a promise to revisit the cold case, something his predecessor, Robert Morgenthau, had declined to do. Morgenthau cited a lack of viable evidence, which, to be fair, there was a huge lack of evidence. Like I said, the police, pretty much from the beginning of looking for Etan, came up empty. They had nothing. So the new DA, Vance, he assembled a team consisting of new prosecutors and FBI agents who re-reviewed decades of old interviews, evidence, and suspect statements, including those related to Jose Ramos, the long-time prime suspect. And then in April of 2012, investigators carried out a high-profile excavation of a basement on Prince Street, just a block from Etan's home and the bus stop that he would have picked up the bus for school. In 1979, the basement had belonged to a carpenter named Othniel Miller, who claimed to have had contact with Etan the night before his disappearance. In May of 1979, Miller had been running a carpentry workshop out of that basement, and during the initial search for the missing boy, he had told law enforcement that the night before Etan vanished, they spent 45 minutes together in that basement workshop. Miller would later tell the FBI that he had been changing out of his work clothes when he had encountered Etan, and allegedly he paid Etan $1 to help him out in the shop. So after some questioning, Miller also admitted to having sex with a girl who was only 10 years old in 1979. So obviously this is a person, you might want to keep an eye on. And then in 2012, when the FBI brought their scent dogs to the basement that they had excavated, the dogs had barked and indicated that they'd picked up on the smell of human remains. The following day, officials brought Othniel Miller to the basement area where he was told that the dogs had alerted to this scent. And he is quoted as saying, quote, "What if the body was moved?" End quote. The dig ended up being inconclusive. No evidence was found. However, the public nature of the dig, which had been broadcast on television and published in the papers, this did lead law enforcement to receive a call from a man who claimed that his brother-in-law, Pedro Hernandez, may have been involved with whatever happened to Etan Patz. At the time of Etan's disappearance, Pedro Hernandez was 18 years old and working as a clerk in a bodega located at West Broadway and Prince Street. This would have been directly along the route that Etan would have walked from his home to the bus stop. The store was on the same block where Etan would have caught the bus, just steps from the corner of Prince and West Broadway, where Etan disappeared. On May 24th, 2012, New York Police Commissioner Raymond Kelly announced that Pedro Hernandez, a 51-year-old resident of Mapleshade, New Jersey, was in custody after confessing to involvement in Etan's disappearance. As it turned out, in the years after Etan vanished, Hernandez had told multiple people that he'd killed someone in New York City. But his statements and the details of them varied widely. So I guess that Pedro had become very, very religious, and he kind of went on like a church getaway with a bunch of people. And during that time, he had told another member of the church that he had done something to a kid in the basement of his workplace. I'm not going to say the word of what Pedro claimed he did to this boy child, but it starts with an S. He then told this other church person that he had stabbed the kid multiple times with a pointy stick. Now, also in the early 80s, Pedro Hernandez had told his neighbor, Mark Pike, that a black kid had thrown a ball at him and he'd lost it and strangled the kid and killed the kid. Hernandez also told his first wife, Daisy Rivera, that a teenager had violated him, had made inappropriate sexual advances towards him, and this led to Pedro Hernandez getting very angry and then strangling the teenager. When he was taken into custody, police conducted a 7-hour interrogation, and initially Hernandez made statements and confessed. But this was before he was read his Miranda rights. But then after he was read his Miranda rights, he repeated his confession on video and then later again to an assistant district attorney. So we got 3 confessions altogether. In his recorded confession, which would have been the second confession, Hernandez claimed he had never seen Etan before encountering him that day in the neighborhood, at which point he lured him to the basement of the bodega by offering him a soda. I'm going to play you some short portions of his recorded confession now.
Then I approached him and I asked him if he wanted something to drink.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't answer me. He nodded his head. I went down to the basement. He followed me to the basement. And whatever happened there, I choked him. It was something that just happened like quick. I don't know why I did it. I don't know why it happened.
As you talk about it, are you surprised?
I don't even know if it happened. I never saw his face.
So, when you went down into the basement with him, you didn't go into the store with him. You went down to the basement with him, and he followed you, or
He followed.
you said, "Come down to the basement with
No,
me."
he followed me
And where were you going to get the soda from?
in the basement. There was a fridge in the basement.
So he went down the stairs, and he was behind you. Is that right?
He was behind me.
Mm-hmm.
Then he went in front of me. I stood behind him.
Mm-hmm.
And I choked him. Then when I choked him, I started shaking. And there was a plastic bag and a box. Where did it came from? I do not know. It was thick. So I put him inside the bag. Then I tied the bag with the same bag. I put him inside the box. It was like a banana box, something, I don't remember. What kind of box was it? It was a cardboard box. I put him up on my shoulder. I carried him out of the store, out to like a block away, a block and a half away from the store.
You said that he came out in front of you and you choked him. And did you give him a soda?
No, he didn't get the soda.
Did he resist?
No,
What did he do? You were facing him from the back?
I was facing him from the back. He was like standing here, I was standing behind him.
Mm-hmm.
I shook him. He went down like this with his hands. He went down to the floor. I put him in the bag. Simple as that.
And how long did it take before he went down to the floor? How long did you have your hands around his neck?
Maybe a minute, 2 minutes.
Did he make any sounds while you were choking him?
No,
But you mentioned that his hands hung down.
collapse. His hands went down. He didn't make any sound, nothing.
You took him a block and a half away and you put him down. And was there other garbage there also when you put him down?
There was no garbage. It
So you just put him
was
down.
like a hallway in the basement.
Mhm.
It was like a walkway, the hallway. They had no doors, nothing.
Mhm.
I just went down the steps, 4 steps, and set the box in between the hallway there and came back.
Mhm.
Who took it? I don't know. Anything happened to it? I don't know. I have no idea. Somebody must have took it. Somebody must have known something. Anybody answer? I don't know. I have no idea. That was the truth. I don't know nothing.
You went back to work.
When I went back to work, and then later on that day, I heard the news that there was a child missing.
Mhm.
And they show his picture on the TV.
Mhm.
But I didn't say anything because I didn't feel like I had to say anything. So I didn't feel like I do anything wrong.
At some point, you went back to take a look at the box. When did that happen? And
the
at
next
what
day.
time? And
The next day I
tell
went
me about
back,
that.
like maybe 10 o'clock in the morning,
Mhm.
to see if the box was there, but it was not there. It was gone.
Hmm.
Somebody must have removed it from there. I don't know if they put it in the garbage. I don't know what happened to it. I don't know if he left. I don't know if he's still alive.
Mm.
He might be alive. Because he was still alive in the box.
Tell me about that. You said that he was still alive. Tell
He
me
was
what
still
you
moving in the
remember.
box. He was moving in the box.
What did you feel?
I feel his movement in the box when I was carrying him.
Mhm.
He must have been still alive. He probably is alive somewhere. Who knows? I don't know.
Pedro Hernandez was arrested, and on November 14th, 2012, a grand jury indicted him on second-degree murder and first-degree kidnapping. The following month, on December 12th, Hernandez formally pleaded not guilty in Manhattan Supreme Court, and in early 2013, his defense attorney, Harvey Fishben, filed a motion to dismiss, arguing that his client's confession had most likely been false or coerced. Pedro Hernandez did have an extensive history of mental illness and low IQ. Even before Etan had gone missing, doctors had documented Hernandez's obsessive thoughts, hallucinations, and borderline impaired intelligence. He'd been diagnosed with several disorders, including psychotic disorder, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, chronic mental illness, and memory impairments. Between 1992 and 2014, various intelligence tests would place Hernandez's IQ between 67 and 76, which put him in the lower 1 to 5 percentile in comparison with other adults around his age. Now, in response to the motion to dismiss, Judge Maxwell Wiley ruled in May of 2013 that the evidence against Hernandez was legally sufficient and ordered a hearing to determine whether his pre-Miranda statements would be admissible at trial. So basically, the whole first confession, his initial confession that was given to the police before his Miranda rights were read, would that be allowed into the trial? And in September of 2014, a key pretrial hearing addressed whether Hernandez truly understood that he could have left before being read his Miranda rights, that he didn't have to go with the police, that he didn't have to talk to them. Ultimately, the judge allowed some statements to be used, and a trial was scheduled for January of 2015.
51-year-old Pedro Hernandez was arraigned on charges of second-degree murder in the death of Etan Patz yesterday. The suspect appeared in court over a closed-circuit TV from a hospital room. Hernandez is being treated for an existing health problem and is under psychiatric evaluation after threatening suicide. Police say Hernandez confessed to the strangling of the 6-year-old boy in a 3.5-hour videotaped statement 3 days ago. In 1979, Hernandez was an 18-year-old stock boy at a grocery store just 200 feet from the Patz's front door.
Excuse me, please.
Etan's parents, Stan and Julie Patz, returned home Friday. Friends tell us news of the arrest is still sinking in.
Please, man, please.
Police made the arrest after receiving a tip from Hernandez's own family. The suspect's brother-in-law, Jose Lopez, says he has no doubt Hernandez is the killer and that the arrest has been a big relief to the family.
I don't know what to think, really. It's somebody we knew, in the family, to do something like that, and this came out now. He did the right thing, to confess.
Well, a confession in and of itself is not legally sustainable for a conviction, but it needs to be corroborated. So there's the low bar of corroboration. He confessed to taking a boy named Etan Patz. Well, one corroborating factor is a boy named Etan Patz did disappear. He did work in the deli a block away. He did know Etan Patz as a kid who passed through the neighborhood and so on. But they're going to look for more, which is how often did he make these statements? To how many family members? What exactly did he say? And over how many years? Are there people who worked in the store with him back then who remember, on that day, I remember he disappeared for half an hour. And when he came back, I said, where were you? And he said X. They're going to have to build around this.
The trial began on January 5th, and the core evidence in that trial was Pedro Hernandez's confession. Though his confession had been recorded twice after his Miranda warnings, and again to the assistant DA, the defense highlighted that Hernandez may not have been fully able to understand his rights or what he was doing. After about 3 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated and ultimately hung 11-1 for conviction, which means 11 of the jurors wanted to convict, 1 was the holdout, and this led to a mistrial in May of 2015. A new trial began October 19th, 2016 in New York, and prosecutors revisited Hernandez's confession and addressed mental health concerns. Michael Wellner, a commissioned forensic expert, testified for the prosecution at both trials, the first and the second, arguing that Hernandez had genuinely felt guilt and crafted consistent confessions over time, even before police questioned him. Wellner felt that this suggested authenticity rather than fabrication. Dr. Bruce Frumpkin, a defense expert, challenged the confession, telling the jury that Hernandez was unlikely to even understand his rights, and he was susceptible to suggestion or coercion due to his mental limitations and his extremely limited intelligence. Throughout both trials, the prosecution had made it clear that they believed Hernandez had been exaggerating his intellectual defects and his mental health issues. The prosecution claimed he suffered only from, some depression and nothing else. But Frumpkin testified that Pedro Hernandez actually exhibited psychotic symptoms, and he had been found to have multiple serious psychological issues. He said that a neuropsychologist who had examined Hernandez at the request of his lawyer had even detected signs of early dementia. So that's not good for memory, especially if something happened in 1979 and you're not confessing to it until 2012. So after 9 days of deliberation in this second trial, the jury returned with a guilty verdict on February 14th, 2017, and Pedro Hernandez was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Basically, he would be eligible for parole at 25 years, or else he's in there for life. Now, if you think there was a lot of conversation around Pedro Hernandez's confession, you would be right, because this was literally the only evidence the prosecution had against him. That, I guess, and his proximity to where Etan Patz went missing from, his proximity to the bus stop, his proximity to Etan's home, which means, they were often in the same neighborhood, and maybe Hernandez saw Etan and sort of targeted him and took the opportunity of seeing the boy alone to finally pounce. That's the only evidence. They had zero physical evidence. And if I'm being honest with you, their circumstantial evidence was pretty weak as well. We all know that false confessions are far more common than people realize, particularly in high-pressure, emotionally charged cases like the disappearance of Etan Patz. Decades of research and analysis of wrongful convictions, including studies conducted by the Innocence Project, have shown false confessions play a role in roughly 25 to 30% of DNA-based exonerations in the United States. So what's that mean, DNA-based exonerations? It means somebody was arrested and charged with a crime before the whole science and DNA system and the forensic system had evolved. And then after, when that evidence was tested, again, they found that DNA at the crime scene on the victim exonerated the person they had in prison for that crime, which is scary. We also know that police often use something called the Reid technique style of interrogation. This involves hours of intense questioning, presenting evidence that could be real or could be fabricated, because once again, we know it's a fact that police are allowed to lie to suspects during questioning. They can lie. They don't have to be honest. They can say whatever they want. Also, the Reid technique sort of involves minimizing the consequence of confessing, kind of like they did with Jesse Miss Kelly Jr. in West Memphis 3. Like, if you tell us what you guys did, we'll make a deal with you. We'll give you leniency. Now, because of these tactics, suspects can reach a point of exhaustion, confusion, helplessness, where they feel that confessing, even falsely, is the only way to put a stop to the interrogation. Additionally, people with mental illness, intellectual disabilities, or low IQs like Pedro Hernandez, they're going to be particularly vulnerable to this. They may not fully understand their rights or the legal implications of what they're confessing to, what their confession is going to lead to. They may not even fully understand the line between the truth and what their interviewers are telling them happened, because these individuals are more prone to suggestibility, where leading questions or repeated narratives are kind of maybe going to have these suspects adopt details they didn't experience. We've seen it. Once again, Jesse Miss Kelly Jr. is a perfect example. When he was in the room with the police officers and they were putting pictures in front of him and asking him questions and then sort of tapping on the picture that they wanted him to choose. They're leading questions. They're leading him to follow the narrative they've already set out in their heads. Or they'll say something like, "Oh, Jesse, isn't this what you did? Isn't this what happened? Isn't this what you and your friends did to those little boys, in Robin Hood Hills?" They're going to start, I guess, telling him what they theorize happened and sort of making him be like, "Yeah, actually that did happen." Or, "Yeah, this is clearly what they want me to say and I want this questioning to stop, so I'm just going to go along with it." In more rare cases, suspects can even become convinced they must have committed the crime, especially if they suffer from hallucinations, delusions, or dissociative episodes. If someone who has a bad memory or has a habit of imagining things, seeing things, hearing things that aren't there, if they're, repeatedly told, "Hey, we the police, we have all the evidence," or, "Hey, we have evidence, we know you were there, we know you did this," the suspect may begin to doubt their own memory because their memory has never been reliable for them before. What they see with their own eyes, what they hear with their own ears has never been reliable for them before. They're struggling with this mental illness. They're struggling with memory gaps and things like that. So they might believe that the story coming from these authority figures is accurate. And I mean, let's honestly look at Pedro Hernandez's confession and ask ourselves how valid it sounds. I personally feel it sounds ridiculous, and there's several reasons why it probably isn't true. Hernandez claims he lured Etan down to the bodega basement, but for what reason? According to Hernandez, as soon as they were down there, he just took the boy's life with no motive whatsoever. He didn't assault him. He didn't do anything to him, at least according to the confession. And then he put his body in a bag, and then into a box, and walked a few blocks with the box and left the box in an alley. But then when he went back for the box several days later, it was gone. Like, nobody reported finding a box with a body inside of it. Pedro Hernandez then said later in his interview, well, maybe Etan got out of the box and walked away because he was still alive. When I was walking the box over to the alley, I could feel him moving. None of this makes sense, simply based on the extensive search that ensued after Etan went missing and continued for weeks. Hundreds of police officers and hundreds of volunteer searchers on foot, searching the entire area around Etan's apartment over and over again, every block after block after block, every building, every alley. Because at first they thought he must have gotten lost and he was scared, so he found some place to hide. And they were checking everywhere. And when they couldn't find it in like the one city block around his house and the bus stop, they expanded their search. They went out several blocks, all the way to the Hudson River. They checked inside buildings, outside buildings. They checked alleyways, air shafts, fire escapes, rooftops, everything. A box that was big enough to hold a 6-year-old boy just sitting in some alley would have obviously been looked into and checked. And if somebody had come across the box who wasn't, searching for Etan and had found what they had found, they would have called the police. And if Etan was still alive and he'd, gotten out of the box, someone would have found him, or at least seen him. He would have gone looking for help, especially after he had just been attacked by some strange man in the basement of a bodega. The confession does not sound plausible at all. It doesn't seem that Pedro Hernandez really remembers anything, because in the beginning of the confession, he's talking about how he killed Etan, put him in the box, was carrying him. But then later on, like 20, 30 minutes after, he's like, oh yeah, by the way, he was still alive. It's like he's remembering things as he's going through the confession. But don't you think the first time you went through this confession, when you first talked about putting Etan's body in the box, something as, important as you felt him moving so you knew he was still alive would have occurred to you the first time? I don't know. It doesn't seem plausible at all. And with no physical evidence to support it, I personally don't believe it should have been enough to secure a conviction. That's bananas to me. And once again, we are talking about a case from 1979, but that's not when the trial happened. That's not when he was convicted. He was convicted in 2017, which is really not that long ago. Now, why was Pedro Hernandez going around after Etan went missing, telling people stories about how he had killed a kid in New York City? Hernandez had been diagnosed with schizotypal personality disorder. This is a condition that's characterized by distorted thinking, paranoia, magical beliefs, social withdrawal, and occasional hallucinations or bizarre fantasies. People with this disorder may confuse intrusive thoughts or imagined scenarios with reality. If Hernandez had repeated intrusive visions or imagined narratives about harming a child, over time he may have internalized them as actual memories. And am I saying that this is a good guy? Am I saying he's never done anything wrong in his life? Am I saying he's never hurt a kid in his life? No. I just don't think he had anything to do with what happened to Etan Patz. So is it possible that Pedro Hernandez was having fantasies or intrusive thoughts or kind of delusions about hurting a child? It's possible. And this is honestly only supported by the fact that the story he told his fellow churchgoer, the story he told his neighbor Mark, the story he told his first wife Daisy, they were all very different, very different. In one story, he'd stabbed the kid with a pointy stick. In another, it was a black child, not a blonde, blue-eyed child who'd thrown a ball at him. And in another, it was a teenager who he had strangled. It's possible that these weren't intentional lies, they were confabulations, distorted memories that felt real to Pedro, who was experiencing them. These variations in stories might mean that Hernandez had no concrete memory of a real crime, but instead carried a pervasive internal sense of guilt or evil. And like I said earlier, we do know that he became deeply religious. In a lot of cases, religious guilt can amplify intrusive thoughts, especially when someone is vulnerable, isolated, or believes they're being punished or judged by a higher power. That inner torment could have driven Pedro Hernandez to confess to something over and over, not because he did anything, but because he felt, shame. He felt broken inside and he needed to release something. All of this might explain why he confessed spontaneously to all those people without being prompted by evidence or pressure, even years before police got involved. And then, when Etan's face began to appear everywhere in the media, on flyers and milk cartons, and this went on for decades, someone like Pedro Hernandez might have absorbed these images deeply. Over time, it's possible he misidentified a traumatic or violent memory, whether real or imagined, and sort of overlaid Etan's image onto it, especially when he was brought into the police station for questioning for 7 hours. And they're continuing to tell him, like, hey, we know it was you. I don't know if they told him that, but, we think it was you. This kid went missing. You worked at that bodega. Like, can you remember that day? Even though it's, 30-something years after? A confession shouldn't even be held to any standard when it comes decades after the crime. But that brings us to April of 2024. When Pedro Hernandez, who was then 64 years old, and his lawyers appealed his conviction. And in that paperwork, we find out that after Hernandez confessed, and this was after 7 hours of being questioned by the police, that was before his Miranda rights were read to him. And then after they'd been read to him, like I said, the police turned on a camera and videotaped Hernandez repeating this confession. We also found out that police had interviewed Hernandez and other employees of the bodega in 1979 when Etan went missing, and at the time, they didn't view him or treat him as a suspect. The paperwork also brings up 2 alternate suspects that law enforcement had been focused on at one point or another during the investigation into Etan's disappearance. Othniel Miller, the carpenter whose workshop basement had been searched in April of 2012, and an individual we have briefly touched on already, Jose Ramos. Ramos first came on our radar in March of 1982 when he was arrested after attempting to lure 2 young boys into a 50-foot-long drainage tunnel in Van Cortlandt Park, which is located in the North Bronx area of New York City. The 2 boys would later tell police that Ramos, who was 38 years old at the time, had basically grabbed their backpacks, stolen their backpacks, and ran away with the backpacks, forcing the boys to chase after him. And then they got to this drainage tunnel, and Ramos promised to give the book bags back if the boys entered the tunnel with him. But instead, these were smart boys. They ran off. They were like, nah, dude, we're not going. We don't even want our school books. You can keep them. This is going to give us a perfect excuse for why our homework's not done. They ran off. They told their parents, who brought them to the police station. And then shortly after, Ramos was arrested and the drainage tunnel was searched, leading to the discovery that Ramos had been living in that tunnel for some time. Inside the tunnel, police found a bunch of things, including television sets, stereos, toasters, children's clothing, a wedding gown, designer jeans, kids' toys, dolls, adult magazines, a book titled The Astrological Guide to Sex, and also a random kitten. And among the junk that was found, police recovered a Gucci wallet. And inside that wallet, they found identification for Jose Ramos, as well as 7 photos of young boys. 3 of the photos featured these young boys as well as Ramos, and he had his arms around them. The other 4 were just headshots of the boys, but the police on the scene noticed something startling. All the boys resembled the missing Etan Patz in some way. They were all around the same age, they all had blonde hair and blue eyes. And Ramos told police that the boys in the photos were his friends. He's a 30-something-year-old man, by the way, and he said he had met them on a trip to New Orleans the previous year. He also said that one of the pictures featured the son of his girlfriend. But here's the thing. This girlfriend had once babysat Etan Patz. She'd been hired to walk Etan to school during the bus strike that lasted several weeks, and it only started to end the week before Etan vanished. Now, John Miller, who at that time was a correspondent and highly respected crime reporter for WNBC, he got wind of the police activity with Ramos, who was being known as Tunnel Man, and the possible connection to Etan Patz, and he rushed right over to the drainage tunnel. Miller said, quote, Ramos had all these kids' toys, dolls, porno magazines, a book called The Astrological Guide to Sex, and photos of blonde, blue-eyed kids, and they all looked like Etan Patz. The photos were taken in dime store strip machines, and some of them were of Ramos hugging the kids. I'm going through this stuff, and I come upon a letter to Jose Antonio Ramos on the Lower East Side from the Social Security Administration, and it's postmarked 1978. a light bulb comes on. Lower East Side, 1978. So I do a story for the 10 o'clock news that night about the drainpipe man, and I lead with a picture of Etan Patz. End quote. In Ramos's tunnel, police had found records of Social Security and welfare payments that were sent to an address on East 4th Street in the Village. This was just a block away from the Patz apartment. Ramos also had a valid passport, which showed authorities that he had traveled to a few places in Europe the previous summer. We now have to go through the timeline of Jose Ramos, who he was, what his connection to Etan Patz was, and the reign of terror he inflicted upon children throughout the United States. Jose Ramos was born in July of 1943 in the Bronx, the oldest of 5 boys, and he dropped out of high school and joined the Navy in 1960. At some point in his life, he'd been a patient at the Bronx Psychiatric Center and had done outpatient at North Central Bronx Hospital. He'd also spent time in the psych unit at Bellevue, where he was hospitalized with symptoms of confusion, disorientation, and auditory hallucinations, and he was treated with Thorazine, which is an antipsychotic drug. In the 70s, Ramos became a drifter, traveling around the country, making a living off of selling odds and ends and trinkets on the street. And during this time, he was repeatedly arrested for burglary in San Francisco, for vagrancy in Baton Rouge, for exposing himself in New Orleans, and for contributing to the delinquency of a minor in Alabama. In August of 1982, just months after the drainage tunnel incident, Ramos was arrested again. Detective Joseph Galfand had spotted Ramos and 3 young boys, who were estimated to be between the ages of 9 and 12, hanging out not far from the Playland Arcade, which I guess at that time was a place that PDF files were known to gather and prey on young children. Galfand followed Ramos and the 3 boys as they walked to a deserted parking lot on 39th Street, and then they walked up a concrete ramp where they climbed over a low wall to an adjoining rooftop. Galfand continued to watch when they were on the rooftop, and he said that Ramos was just starting to unzip his pants, but then the detective accidentally stepped on a piece of glass. It made a noise. It alerted Ramos to Galfand's presence. He turned around and saw him, and then Galfand pulled out his gun and was like, "Freeze, you're under arrest." He arrested him. At the police station, the 3 boys told detectives that Ramos had offered to pay one of them to perform an oral act on him, and he threatened to hurt the boys if they didn't comply. They searched Ramos's backpack, and they did find that he had a hunting knife, I believe, in the backpack, and the boys had said that Ramos was threatening to hurt them with a knife. And in the backpack, there was another series of photographs that featured Ramos's girlfriend's son. Detective Galfand also noticed that not only did Ramos' girlfriend resemble Etan Patz, but so did the 3 boys who Ramos had tried to lure onto the rooftop for nefarious purposes. So Galfand called the missing person squad and informed them about his theory. He's like, "Hey, the boys that Ramos tried to lure into the drain pipe looked like Etan Patz. The pictures we found in the drain pipe looked like Etan Patz. These pictures of Ramos's girlfriend's son looks like Etan Patz. And the boys that he's trying to lure to the rooftop also look like Etan Patz. So could this guy who lived close to the Patz family at the time of Etan's disappearance, well, could he possibly be involved with what happened to him?" So like I said, Ramos was arrested. He was charged with endangering the welfare of a minor, also attempted S-word. Once again, I'm not going to say the word, but the 3 boys never showed up for their court appearance, so the charges were inevitably dropped. At that point, feeling the heat was on, Jose Ramos left New York State. But in 1983, the girlfriend of Jose Ramos was interviewed along with her son, who was 8 at the time. This woman, who we will call Laura, she told police that she had never introduced Etan to her boyfriend, Jose Ramos, who she didn't even know as Jose Ramos, by the way. I think he went by like Michael. He didn't go by his real name with her, but she said she had never introduced Etan to her boyfriend, Jose Ramos, or Michael, at any time. And she had never introduced them as far as she knew. They had never met, they had never encountered each other. However, Stuart Graois, who remember would become an expert on Jose Ramos, he claimed that before Etan disappeared, Etan and his mother had been walking through Washington Square Park when they'd come across Laura, who was Etan's babysitter, and her shaggy-haired boyfriend. And this would be the first and only known encounter between Etan Patz and Jose Ramos. And Laura also admitted that she knew Ramos sometimes followed her without her knowing. She had found that out afterwards. So basically she's saying, I never introduced them, but he did follow me sometimes. So maybe he followed me to work one morning when I was walking Etan to school and he watched us. I don't know. Now, when Laura's 8-year-old son was questioned, he admitted that Ramos had been repeatedly assaulting him for the past 3 to 4 years. And when I say assault, I mean, once again, the S word. I hope you guys are picking up what I'm putting down because I can't say it for many reasons. And then Laura was told what had happened to her son, what her son was claiming happened. And she said, oh, she had no idea. She was shocked. Now, at the time when she was being questioned, it didn't seem that the police really believed what Laura was saying, that she had no idea this Jose Ramos guy was bad news. She was given a polygraph where she showed deception when asked the question as to whether or not she'd ever been in a car with Jose Ramos and Etan Patz at the same time. And I'm just going to put it out here. I don't believe in polygraphs. I don't think that they're valid. I don't think that, a broken clock is right at least once a day kind of thing. Yeah, do they get lucky sometimes? Yeah, but as far as the polygraph that Etan's father, Stanley, took, it means nothing to me. As far as this polygraph that Laura took, it means nothing to me. And later, Laura would tell Vanity Fair, quote, when I met Michael, which is what Jose called himself, he was a funny, comical type. We slept together, but sex wasn't the main part of our relationship. When I moved to the Lower East Side near 14th Street, he got a place in a tenement near Tompkins Square Park, and I was at his place a couple of times. One time he invited me and my son for dinner, and he went all out to make it look nice. He had parachute silk type of material draped over the ceiling, and a tablecloth and candles and nice dishes. My son seemed to really enjoy this guy's attention. I never saw my son afraid of Jose Ramos, so I allowed my son to stay over at his apartment so I could have a night off, end quote. I have so many problems. I have so many problems with this statement, and it's yeah. Do I believe that Laura introduced the two or that she somehow arranged for Etan to be taken by Jose? No, I don't at all. Do I believe that she turned a blind eye and put her son in danger? Yeah, of course. She's yeah, we had a great relationship. He was a funny, comical type guy. Sex was never a big part of the relationship. Of course it wasn't. Of course it, because you're not his type, if you know what I mean. He likes blonde-haired, blue-eyed little boys, like your son. So you're not his type. So sex won't be a big part of your relationship. And he's using Laura to get to her son. And then she's yeah, he invited us to a nice dinner for me and my son, and he made it all romantical and put up silk on the ceilings and tablecloth and lit candles and used nice dishes. That seems like something you would do if you were going to have a date, if it was just Ramos and Laura. But the fact that she's bringing her son and he went all out, yeah, you're doing this to impress the son, to groom the son, to win the son over. And then she says, hey, my son had a really good time. That's the point. That's the point, that for him to have a good time and trust this dude. And I never saw him afraid of Jose Ramos, so I allowed my son to stay over at his apartment so I could have a night off. The hell are you talking about, Laura? It's disturbing to me. You don't know this man. You have already now admitted you never even knew his real name until he was arrested for being the pipe tunnel guy. And you allowed your son to stay alone with him at his apartment so you could have a night off when you didn't even know this dude? You didn't even know him? You didn't even know him. I can't. Sorry. I'm judging here. So remember, Jose Ramos kind of dropped off the map after he gets released when the three boys don't show up to court. And then in March of 1983, Jose Ramos turned up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, at the annual gathering of the Rainbow Family. The Rainbow Family of Living Light was a loosely organized countercultural group that emerged in the early 1970s, born out of the hippie movement with roots in anti-war activism, environmentalism, and kind of broader back to the land movement. And I say they still are. I believe they're still an active group. Their first gathering had been held in 1972 at Strawberry Lake in Colorado with the intent to create a temporary utopia of peace, love, and communal living away from capitalism and mainstream institutions. The group claimed to reject formal leadership. They were very suspicious of government and authority figures, traditional authority, and their beliefs were spiritual with a focus on Native American rituals, New Age spirituality, and Eastern philosophy. Their annual gatherings were held in different national forests in the summer. They lasted for a week, and attendance would range from a few hundred to over 20,000 people, depending on the year and, how the group's growing. The activities that went on during that week were, pretty innocent for the most part. Communal cooking, spiritual ceremonies, drumming circles, dancing. But then you also had, use of psychedelics, cannabis, they had healing circles, things like that. And although the group did not publicly advertise or market their community or their gatherings, word of mouth, both positive and negative, did that for them. Some described the Rainbow family as a rare example of voluntary utopia, a living experiment in cooperative anarchy. But local residents and law enforcement were always wary when the group came to town because of the well-known and widespread reports of rampant drug use, medical emergencies, including drug overdoses, and some criminal activity like theft, assaults, and the rare case of sexual violence. So in 1983, when Ramos joined the group's annual get-together in Michigan, it did not take long for him to make his presence known. Garrett Beck, a member of the group and a part of their private security team, said, quote, Ramos was caught in Kid Village with his hand in the pants of a little 9-year-old boy with light brown hair. We brought him to the camp used by the Shanti Sena, which is Rainbow's internal security, and he was wearing a black vest covered with buttons and what we call jibber jabber, little doodads and necklaces, pins and dangling thingies. He said he heard voices that told him to do these things, and that when he heard these voices, he was helpless, but he basically denied the charge. And when we confronted him with the evidence, he said, it's just like that case back in New York, because I have this problem. They want to accuse me of disappearing that kid. End quote. According to Garrett Beck, when Ramos was asked which case he was speaking of, he said it was the Patz case. And just for some context, Kid Village, when they say, oh, he was in Kid Village, I would assume that when the grown-ups are dancing and doing their psychedelics, the kids are staying with a dedicated childcare person at the place in the camp that they would designate Kid Village, the place where the kids would be. Now, at that time, Ramos was told he could stay in their gathering. So these are very open-minded people, I guess. He could stay under the condition that he would be accompanied by a member of their security team at all times. And apparently, these terms were not acceptable to Jose Ramos, and he took off, leaving behind the 2 male companions he had arrived with. Now, these 2 men were an adult named Frank Kahlo, who went by the nickname Saxophone Sonny due to the fact that he played saxophone on the street corner, which is how he'd met Ramos. I guess they were selling their wares on the same street corner. And the second person was a teenager who we will call Nicholas. And Nicholas had blonde hair and blue eyes. We're going to talk more about Nicholas in a minute, so remember him. Once again, put a pin in that. So in 1985, Ramos again showed up to the Rainbow family gathering in Missouri. And at that time, the group's security team took a photo of him as well as taking photos of his 2 male companions, Saxophone Sonny and Nicholas. That year, Ramos became friendly with 2 group members, a computer operator and his wife from Erie, Pennsylvania. But Ramos seemed especially interested in the couple's 2 young sons. The following August, he showed up to the couple's home, and he was there for several days. Garrett Beck said, quote, Ramos shows up at these people's home in Erie. He painted their garage and fixed the carburetor on their truck, and he visited them several times from August to Thanksgiving time. The couple trusted him and left him alone with their 2 sons while they went off for a day or so, and he molested one or both of the boys, end quote. What is it about Jose Ramos, who, if you see pictures of him, he looks like, a protege of Charles Manson. What is it about him where he's able to consistently convince parents, oh, I'm safe, leave your little boys with me? What is it about him? This is getting out of control. Once again, I judge these parents. I also judge these parents because at that time, according to the Rainbow family, no one reported it to the police because remember, they didn't trust the authorities, so they decided to handle the issue internally. I hope they got their kids some therapy. Who the hell knows? Probably not. Probably not. They decided to handle it internally until Jose Ramos popped back up at the Rainbow family gathering at Heart's Content National Park in Allegheny, Pennsylvania in 1986. Now, that year, Pennsylvania State Police had gotten the heads up that this counterculture group, the Rainbow Family, they were going to be holding their annual gathering there, and they knew they had to be prepared because according to the Missouri Highway Patrol, when the Rainbow Family had been at Mark Twain National Park the year before, the group had consumed a ton of marijuana, a ton of ecstasy, a ton of LSD, and this had caused some trouble, some issues. So 2 state troopers went undercover at the campsite that year with hidden cameras, and they observed the group for 4 days, witnessing what they felt was basically debauchery. One state trooper's report stated, quote, "Many of these dancers were either partially clothed or completely nude. Other dancers would be completely covered with mud or have had symbols painted on their bodies," end quote. And although it sounds like the Rainbow Family had good intentions, they wanted peace and brotherhood, and they just wanted to be left alone to dance like nymphs in the forest, which, like, who can blame them? They may not have been anticipating that outsiders like Jose Ramos could join in, and he could have not one good intention in his mind. Drugs, nudity, feral adults too distracted by dancing and frolicking and by their own intoxication to notice what was going on, this would create the perfect environment for a child predator to swoop in and commit his disgusting acts undetected, which is most likely why Ramos continued going back to the Rainbow Family gatherings year after year. That year, 1986, Ramos arrived with his 2 companions, Saxophone Sonny and Nicholas, along with a 4-year-old Akita dog named Jessie, and they were all driving a 1978 blue Ford school bus that Ramos had purchased at an Air Force auction in Coconut Grove, which is in Florida. So at that time, Nicholas, the teenager, he would have been about 15 or 16 years old, and this would have been the same age that Etan Patz would have been had he not gone missing. And Nicholas looked very much like Etan, and it would eventually be theorized by police that Ramos had been sexually abusing Nicholas for many years and that potentially Nicholas was Etan, and that Ramos had kidnapped him in 1979 and just kept him with him so he could abuse him all these years. Now, apparently, Nicholas's parents owned and operated an orphanage in Columbus, Ohio, which doesn't make me feel much better, right? Because as it turns out, Nicholas's father had supplied Ramos with like a bunch of baseball cards and Star Wars toys that Ramos would use to gain the trust of little boys. So it's like, what kind of father is this? Like, is this guy letting Nicholas go off with Ramos? Is he intentionally giving Ramos the toys and things, knowing what he's going to do with them? And this guy's running an orphanage. It just, I don't feel good about it at all. So Barry Adams, one of the Rainbow Family security team, said, quote, "No one made the connection between the 83 and 85 and the Allegheny National Forest in 86. His beard was a little longer. His name was a little different. But then I went to Kid Village and saw all these Star Wars figures. And I said, hey, man, who's handing out all of this shit to our kids? It's like Santa Claus showing up in the middle of June. It didn't feel right. So I round up my buddies, John Buffalo and Amazing Dave and others, and we go over to Jose's bus and I say, hey, Jose, man, open the door. What's this about you being alone with our kids? And Jose opens the door. Oh, man, he says, I'm not alone with your kids. And just then out comes one of the Fisher kids, who's about 7, and this teenager who's been traveling with Ramos. We took a picture of the teen. We talked to the boy's family, and they told us what their young'un said. Ramos had molested Zachary's brother Adam, who was 8, and he had promised the kids he'd take them into town. And it's my personal belief that Ramos was looking for children to steal. He was some kind of scout, sent into the gathering to scout out easy prey. There are buyers for children. All these rings know each other. They're hooked up. I think Ramos's pattern is that he's a child thief." End quote. So, yeah, it gets worse, by the way. It gets worse. Because we're going to hear from Ramos about what he did. And it wasn't Zachary Fisher, it was Adam Fisher. And these are not their real names, by the way. But we're going to find out what he did. But after being caught, Ramos fled in his bus once again with his dog Jessie, and once again he left his 2 friends behind, but he was later apprehended on Interstate 60 by state troopers Franklin Wills and Donald Bate. And the police officers took Ramos into custody. They charged him with involuntary deviant sexual intercourse, statutory rape, and indecent assault, and photographed the contents of his bus. Jessie, the Akita, was taken to a nearby animal shelter where the owner of the shelter would say that the dog was really sweet, but the only time he jumped up and barked was when her grandson walked by his pen once, and this led her to wonder if maybe Jessie had witnessed what his owner had done and had been doing to other little boys, and if he was reacting in fear and protectiveness when he saw this other young boy, which was the owner's grandson. Maybe he was barking to alert the young boy, like, get out of here, run, you don't want to be here. Now, in prison, Jose Ramos was interviewed by John Bowler, who was the associate director of the local children and youth services. And Ramos gave Bowler his version of events relating to what had happened with the Fisher boys. And this is really hard. I'm going to try to make it as easy as possible to tell and to hear. But it's really hard to hear and to read and to know. It's very difficult. So Ramos claimed that on Wednesday or Thursday, which would have been June 18th or 19th, Adam and Zachary Fisher had come over to his bus around 2 p.m. to take a nap. Zachary had fallen asleep on the floor in the back of the bus, and Adam slept with Jose Ramos in the bed with him. So Adam and Ramos in the bed. And Ramos claimed that it was Adam who had first pulled something out of his pants and then pulled his pants down completely. And Ramos claimed that he and this child had spent some time fondling each other before Ramos ejaculated into his own hand. The following Friday, the two boys once again made their way to Ramos's bus to take a nap, and once again they slept in the same places, Zachary on the floor and Adam in the bed with Ramos. And Ramos again claimed, as he had the first time, that Adam pulled his own pants down first. Ramos then claimed he used his hand on the little boy, on a part of the little boy's body, and then he also used his mouth on a part of the little boy's body. The next night, Ramos claimed that it was Adam, this little boy, who committed an act on Ramos, an act that begins with the letter S. And then Ramos said he committed that same act, the one that begins with the letter S, on Adam. Ramos sheepishly told John Bowler that he admittedly had an issue with sex addiction, and he would later tell a psychiatrist that he'd been sexually abused by an uncle as a child, and that he and one of his brothers had done sexual things together from a very early age. But because John Bowler had not read Ramos his Miranda rights, this confession was not allowed in court, and the Warren County District Attorney Richard Heeman was eventually forced to drop the case. While all of this was happening, Jose's blue school bus was declared abandoned property, and it was towed to Himes Cells and Services, which was owned by Carl Reese. Carl and one of his employees, Tim, began going through the bus, seeing what they could keep and what needed to be tossed. And they also took apart the engine. They found out there was a hole in the engine block, so that wasn't salvageable. And then they went inside the bus to see what they could save, but according to them, it was just an absolute mess. There was like dirt everywhere, bugs, garbage, trash, just random things. And so they basically didn't feel they could save any of it, and they just started throwing everything in a large fire they had made. During this process, Carl discovered something that the police had missed during their initial inspection, and it was the personal diary of Jose Ramos. Pages and pages of script written in Ramos's own hand. Carl tossed the notebook into the fire. And later, Trooper Dan Portzer said, quote, "We're always going to wonder if any of that stuff in the bus would tie Ramos to Etan Patz." Remember, when all of this was happening, we hadn't even heard about Etan Patz. It wasn't until Stu Grabois called me that I found out about the Patz case, end quote. I mean, yes, I think it's completely legitimate that you're always going to wonder what was in that notebook. Maybe, considering what you were arresting this dude for, Jose Ramos, you should have looked better in the van. You should have looked and searched the bus better, and maybe you would have found the notebook, and maybe we would have that evidence. But it was Portzer who would eventually supply Stuart Grabois with tons of information about Jose Ramos and the events that had happened in Warren County, PA. Grabois, who remember had been assigned to Etan's case in May of 1985, had already pegged Ramos as his top suspect in Etan's disappearance. It was interesting to Grabois that Ramos had no income to speak of, aside from like selling things on the road and some government assistance. But after Etan vanished, Ramos had suddenly come into some money, which had allowed him to travel to Europe and the Middle East. Additionally, Ramos had told Saxophone Sonny that he'd received $10,000, although he never said who the money had come from or why he had been given it. In 1989, a federal investigator with the U.S. Attorney's Office walked into Stuart Graois' office with 4 members of the Rainbow Family Security Team. That would be Barry Adams, Garrett Beck, John Buffalo, and Amazing Dave. Of course, we need Amazing Dave. Barry Adams said that as a whole, their group, the Rainbow Family, they didn't trust the government. And he stated, quote, "The feds have been hassling my people for years, but when I met Stu, I liked him. He looked us in the eye. He spoke to us like humans. We both had children in mind," end quote. Graois had been trying to find out the identity of Nicholas, the teenager who was known to travel with Ramos. He thought that Nicholas could potentially be Etan Patz due to the age, the blonde hair, the blue eyes, and similar features such as the nose and mouth. Graois later recalled, quote, "Barry trusted me. I had heard about the teenager on Ramos's bus. I didn't know who he was. Barry had this Polaroid of the teenager. He brought it with him to my office and he said to me, 'Here's a present,'" end quote. Robert Shaw, who was an investigator on Etan's case at that time, along with FBI agent Lisa Smith, they also felt the photo of Nicholas looked like Etan Patz. So they sent the Polaroid of Nicholas to FBI headquarters in Washington, along with photos of Etan, photos of his parents, and photos of his siblings. The computer then created a genetically enhanced image of what Etan Patz would look like at the age of 15 or 16. And Graois said that when you held the Polaroid of Nicholas next to this age-progressed image of Etan Patz, they were almost identical. So Graois, Shaw, and Lisa Smith traveled to Columbus, Ohio, where Nicholas lived and where his parents I guess, reportedly own an orphanage. This is very concerning to me because they wanted to find him. They wanted to talk to him. And they ended up speaking to a priest who knew the family. The priest told them where they could find the teenager, and they drove to his neighborhood. Now, when Nicholas spotted the law enforcement team, they said he was nervous. It looked like he wanted to run. His eyes were searching for exit points, but he realized that he couldn't get away, so he went with the police inside his mother's apartment to talk. They then compared the DNA of Nicholas to the DNA of the Patz family, but there was no match, so Nicholas was not Etan Patz. Although Ohio was a dead end, Stuart Graois still felt like he had won because through his cooperation with the Rainbow family, he'd been able to locate little Adam Fisher. And in 1990, Stuart Graois was deputized to prosecute Jose Ramos in Pennsylvania. And his first order of business was to have Ramos rearrested on the charges from 1986 concerning Adam Fisher. Because remember, those charges had been dismissed because the confession wasn't allowed into court. Ridiculous. So before showing up in court for the Adam Fisher charges, Ramos sent a letter to the judge deciding his case. And in part, that letter read, quote, "I am asking your honor that you not make the child who had sex with me go through the experience all over again in your courtroom," end quote. I'm pissed off. The child who had sex with what? You mean the child you abused? The child you raped? Is that what you mean? These pedophiles, man, they are all the same. So basically, Ramos is saying, don't make this kid go through this all over again. And 3 months later, he appeared in the courtroom, and he'd had his long beard shaved off, and his hair was cut short. And reportedly, Ramos was really pissed off about this because it violated his rights as a Spanish Jew. That's what he said. This guy's going to say all sorts of weird things today. You'll hear about them. So when Ramos showed up in court, there's about 6, 7, half a dozen reporters in there waiting to report on him because of his connection with Etan Patz. And Ramos immediately turned to the reporters and said, quote, "Size 38 uniform, shoes, 10.5, brown socks, trifocal glasses. I'd invite you all to shrimp dinner. That's what we're having tonight, shrimp. The officers are good in the prison, but there's no law library," end quote. In court, Ramos was accompanied by his public defender, Thomas Bonavita, and when the judge asked if he was satisfied with his attorney, Ramos said, quote, "You get what you pay for, Your Honor," end quote, which is like definitely a not so subtle dig at his attorney because you don't pay anything for a public defender. And he's basically saying, like, yeah, he sucks. You get what you pay for. I paid $0. And Bonavita's bringing that much effort here. If I was Thomas Bonavita, I would have just gotten up and left at that point. I would have been like, "You're on your own, you weird child predator. You're on your own." Before even stepping into the courtroom, though, a deal had already been made between Ramos and Stuart Graois, where the state had agreed to drop the S-word charges as long as Ramos pleaded guilty to one count of oral intercourse with a minor. Now, many in the media voiced their disappointment that Stuart Graois had not used this lenient deal to get a confession out of Ramos concerning Etan Patz, but Graois said that had never been his plan. He gave the deal because he had not wanted Adam Fisher to have to testify in court and relive the horrible trauma, and he felt he had other bargaining chips that he could use to get Ramos to talk about Etan. During the sentencing hearing, Graois told the judge that Ramos was a monster, a danger to children, and he should get the maximum sentence. Ramos, in turn, was very off balance by the presence of Stuart Graois. He told the judge, like, listen, I understand the seriousness of what I've done. But then he said, quote, Mr. Graois is overzealous on account of a situation somewhere else, end quote, meaning the Etan Patz case. Ramos is trying to say, like, what I did wasn't really that bad. And, Graois is trying to, like, get me this huge sentence because he thinks I had something to do with Etan Patz. I guess that Ramos didn't think what he did to poor little Adam Fisher was worthy of a long sentence. Of course not. Of course he didn't. Ramos then began moaning and talking about how he had been abused all of his life. He started crying, and then he glared at Stuart Graois, who was only a foot or. And then he glared at Stuart Graois, who at that point was standing only like a foot or two away from him because he was addressing the judge, and he shouted, quote, "That's not right. Graois doesn't have to stand there like he's going to hit me. I'm not doing anything. Where's the justice? I've been asking for justice." End quote. The judge told Ramos that the state had described him as a drifter, but he was more than a drifter. He was a predator of young males. Quote, "You have shown no remorse whatsoever. You haven't denied your acts. You've been attempting to shift responsibility to the victim and his parents. You know these acts are wrong, and you continue to do them. For all these reasons, society has to be protected. I sentence you to 10 to 20 years, end quote. Now, this was a harsh sentence. The most that had been expected was 6 to 12 years, but apparently the judge felt that that was not long enough for Jose Ramos to learn his lesson. And honestly, I agree, like, keep him in prison as long as you can, keep him away from kids. After being sentenced, Ramos, his attorney, and Stuart Graois spoke for a few minutes, and Graois was like, listen, dude, you're going to be behind bars until you're 71. And I have information that strongly suggests you were involved in the disappearance of Etan Patz. You could at least give the Patz family some closure and come clean about what happened. You're probably going to die behind bars. Like, what's up here? Jose Ramos had nothing to say. But at that point, he was the prime suspect in Etan's disappearance. And then in 1991, during an FBI interview, Ramos confessed that on the day Etan Patz disappeared, he'd encountered a young boy in Washington Square Park. He said the boy had blonde hair and blue eyes, and he was bouncing a ball. He was wearing sneakers with bright fluorescent stripes on them. Ramos claimed he had never seen the boy before that day, but he invited him back to his apartment to watch TV. Ramos stated, quote, "When we got there on East 4th Street, I gave him some apple juice from the refrigerator. Then after a while, I picked him up and tried to feel him around between his legs. The kid refused. He wasn't interested. So I took him out of the apartment and we walked over to the Village to the 8th Avenue subway station, and I put him on a subway so he could go visit his aunt in Washington Heights," end quote. Ramos said the boy could have been Etan Patz, but it didn't matter if he was Etan Patz or not because he'd put him safely on a train to Washington Heights, and the last time that Ramos saw this boy, he was alive and well. Now remember, years before, earlier, when Ramos's girlfriend Laura had been interviewed by police, she'd recalled that the day after Etan disappeared, she and Ramos had been watching the news when they saw that police were searching for a missing boy. And Laura had mentioned to Ramos, hey, this is the same boy I used to babysit for. At that point, Ramos had gotten up and told Laura he was going to help the community look for Etan, and then he left. During his interview in 1991, Ramos told the same story and claimed that he did go out looking for Etan, saying, quote, "I was 90% sure the kid I saw on TV was the same as the kid I had in my apartment," end quote. But here's the thing. Etan Patz did not have an aunt who lived in Washington Heights. He didn't know anybody in Washington Heights. And according to the FBI, there were no other reports of disappearances or assaults on children that day. Stuart Graois speculated that Ramos had kept Etan tied up in his apartment after assaulting him. And when he saw the news about the massive search, he panicked at how large scale and publicized it was. So he told Laura he was going out to help look for Etan, but instead he went back to his apartment so he could get rid of the 6-year-old boy. Graois and Robert Shaw theorized that Ramos had possibly sold Etan to another pedophile such as himself, or even perhaps to an underground adoption broker, which is how he managed to be in possession of $10,000 in like a designer wallet. And like I said earlier, Etan Patz was legally declared dead in 2001. And at that point, his parents, Stanley and Julie Patz, filed a wrongful death suit against the Manhattan Supreme Court to officially state that Jose Ramos had killed their son. The judge ended up ruling that Ramos was responsible for the disappearance and presumed death of Etan Patz. And during the hearing, Etan's court-appointed attorney, you're going to have when you're a kid and you're a minor and you're not there, you're going to have an attorney there present to represent your best interests. And this court-appointed attorney claimed that Ramos had confided to his cellmate in 2002 that Etan was dead, there was no body, and there would never be a body. Although Jose Ramos was ordered to pay the Patz family $2 million in damages in the civil lawsuit, which is like, oh, they're never going to get that, right? It's just a sort of performative thing at this time. Obviously, this dude doesn't have $2 million, will never have $2 million, and we don't even know where he got that $10,000 from. But even though he was ordered to pay this restitution in damages, his release date was still scheduled for 2012. Jose Ramos was never criminally charged or prosecuted in relation to Etan's disappearance, and the civil ruling was even vacated in 2016 after the focus of the investigation shifted to Pedro Hernandez. Ramos was eventually released from prison in November of 2012, at which time he was immediately rearrested that same day on a Megan's Law violation, which occurs when a convicted sex offender fails to comply with notification requirements such as registering their address with law enforcement and keeping their, movements and their whereabouts known to law enforcement, because law enforcement has to let the neighbors and the community know that this sex offender is there. Now, before he was released, Ramos had given police an address where he claimed he would be living with his cousin, but when law enforcement looked into this before his release, they found that the cousin had not lived at that address for decades. And when Ramos's cousin was located, she told detectives that she had not seen or spoken to Ramos in 35 years and she would never allow him to live with her. So on the date he's supposed to get out, Jose Ramos, they opened the gate, he walks out, and they came out and immediately rearrested him and put him back in prison. This offense resulted in a short sentence. So after Pedro Hernandez and his legal team submitted their motion in 2024, a federal appellate court reversed the conviction on July 21st, 2025, and a new trial has been ordered for Hernandez, or at least they're basically saying if the prosecution would like to have a new trial, we can do that. The appeals panel ruled that the trial judge had given jurors incorrect and legally prejudicial instructions on how to treat Hernandez's multiple confessions. The only real evidence against Hernandez was his confession, but Hernandez had not been read his rights before giving that first confession, and the jury was told to ignore that first confession. The appeals court felt that the jury should have also been told that they should ignore the following confessions as well, since those following confessions might have been influenced by the first one. So if the first one was coerced, if the first one was sort of gotten falsely or in a bad way, then that means fruit of the poisonous tree. Those other two confessions would also be, not allowed. They shouldn't have been allowed in. Instead, during the second trial, the judge told the jury they had to still consider the later confessions even if they thought the first one was tainted. And that ended up being a big legal mistake. At this point, Pedro Hernandez's conviction is entirely gone, as if it never happened. And if prosecutors don't decide to try him again, he could be released. If there's a new trial, prosecutors will have to start all over from scratch, with over 50 years having gone by. And it's likely that they will not even be able to use his initial confession in a new trial, right? Once again, if it wouldn't have been allowed in at other trials, and if the whole basis of his conviction being thrown out is because of that confession, they wouldn't be able to use it. And what other evidence do they have? None. Zero. They have no evidence against Pedro Hernandez. Now, at this time, Hernandez's lawyers have pointed to Jose Ramos as the potential person who did have a hand in Etan's disappearance, and this is bringing Ramos's name back to the public eye. Ramos is listed as a Category 3 violent sex offender in New York State. That's the highest category. But reports indicate that he now lives overseas, possibly in the Philippines. So what's going to happen now? First of all, my final thoughts. I don't think Pedro Hernandez did this. I don't think he had anything to do with it. I think there's a big possibility that Jose Ramos may have had something to do with it. It just doesn't match his MO. He would have had times after Etan disappeared. So after he would have allegedly had a hand in Etan's disappearance, he would have had multiple opportunities to do the same thing with the Rainbow family kids, right? The kids that were at the annual gathering, the kids that he'd been left alone with in Erie, Pennsylvania, he could have taken them as well. If he's killing them or selling them, he would have done the same thing with those kids, you would think. And it doesn't seem that that's his pattern. It seems his pattern is to just abuse and traumatize and then move on. But I don't know. Jose Ramos could have something to do with it. Anybody could have something to do with it at this point. It always sticks out to me that the bus driver that morning left early with only 6 kids when he should have had over 25. Is it possible that Etan did get to the bus stop, but the bus had already left? And then he continued on thinking maybe he would just walk to school, or maybe he turned around to go back home to tell his parents that he'd missed the bus. And at that point, anything could have happened, right? Anybody could have grabbed him. We don't know. And at this time, with how much time has passed, with how many false confessions and wrong leads have come up, I don't think we ever will know. And I don't think it's very likely that prosecutors will attempt to prosecute Pedro Hernandez again. They don't have anything to prosecute him with. He should never have been in prison. And listen, I'm as much of an advocate for kids as anybody. You guys know that. But I think that putting somebody in prison for something they're not guilty of is a horrible offense. And I think that all those years when everyone thought the person who took Etan Patz was locked up and in prison, the real person who took him was still wandering around, living their lives, maybe even, victimizing further young boys. So at this point, what I would start doing is look for disappearances of these young boys who resembled Etan Patz. Johnny Gosch is one of them. Look at these disappearances, map them out, the age, the look, the location, and kind of see, was Jose Ramos in that area at that time? Who was in the area at that time? If there was an arrest made for one of these abductions, or if there was attempted abductions that got stopped, who was arrested for those? And kind of see if there's any overlap there. I think if the prosecution is going to continue pursuing Etan's case, they have to start from scratch. And that's all I know. But let me know what you guys think in the comments. Do you think that Pedro Hernandez legitimately confessed and that his confession makes sense? Do you think Jose Ramos could be responsible? I think he could be. Of the two, Hernandez and Ramos, it's definitely Ramos for me. He's got the MO. He's doing it all over the place. He lived in the area. His girlfriend was Etan's babysitter. This is just a lot of coincidence, and I don't really believe in coincidences. But if so, what happened to Etan? Did Jose Ramos sell him? Did he kill him? Throw his body in the river? I don't know, but hopefully one day we will know. But let me know what you think. Who could potentially be responsible for this? What do you think about Hernandez? What do you think about Ramos? What do you think about the whole thing? I am really looking forward to hearing your thoughts in the comment section. And don't forget to like this video if you liked it, share it if you think it's worth sharing, and subscribe if you haven't already. Until next time, stay kind, stay beautiful, stay safe, and I'll see you very, very soon. Bye.
Straight down.